Alright, in this video I am going to talk about how you can leverage custom permission levels in a SharePoint site for use with the Power Platform. So just to kind of define the problem that we're trying to solve here. If you're like me, a lot of folks I know when they started in the Power Platform were coming from the world of SharePoint and kind of had that knowledge set, that knowledge base rather, the skill set of how to create a SharePoint list. We knew what lists were, we knew they could store data, we knew they could, if we can then leverage those as data sources for Power Apps and for Power Automate, then we kind of know what we're doing. It made it very quick and easy to ramp up to learn that new skill set. Now the problem, however, is that in order for people, the end users of our apps and our flows, to actually use them, they need access to those lists and libraries. Now, if we give them direct access to the site, then they're actually going to be able to edit that data outside of our app or in our flow. So if you build logic into your app to, for example, not allow them to create a leave entry that starts in the past, then if they can go directly to the list and just create a new item, they can bypass whatever functionality, whatever validation you're using in your app to control that. So this is basically just a way to prevent them from going directly to that interface for the list and making changes directly that are going to bypass any rules that you've set up in your apps and your flows. Now, just talking about kind of default permissions in SharePoint in general. Now, if you're coming from a SharePoint world, you might already be familiar with this. If you're new to SharePoint, I would kind of urge you to pay attention here, because this is, we're not just talking in relation to Power Apps and Power Automate, but it's a good idea to really understand how permissions work in SharePoint, because I'll be honest, I've spent way too much of my professional career cleaning up sites where the permissions have gotten all out of whack, and it's a good idea to just to understand how they work so that you can prevent that from happening to your site, so that you can help, if you're in the IT department in your organization, that you can help the end users who might be managing the site owners, help them to prevent the messes they can create. So there are 5 default permission levels: full control, design, edit, contribute, and read. Some of these, specifically full control, edit, and read, are used by the default user groups in a site. So they're probably aware already that there are 3 user groups in the site: owners, members, visitors. Owners have full control, members have edit, visitors have read. Between those, we have a couple others that really aren't used currently. I mean, they are available to use, but they're just not part of any default functionality. There's a design permission, which is kind of like, it's basically between edit and full control. So it allows them to do a little more than edit, but not quite full control. They can't do things like manage permissions if they have design access. And then between edit and read, we have this contribute permission. This used to be, prior to SharePoint Online and the modern experience, members had contribute permission to a site, which meant that they could basically work with the existing structure of a site, but they couldn't create new lists and libraries. And Microsoft kind of introduced and upgraded that members group to the edit permission to streamline things, to make it to minimize the friction. If a member of a team says, hey, I need a new list for tracking this, they have the access now to create that new list themselves, instead of going to an owner and saying, hey, can you create this list for me? So edit permission is kind of that contribute plus the ability to create lists and libraries, or edit those lists and libraries. Now, the danger of putting your app users directly into any one of these groups is that you're giving them potentially more permission than you really want to. For example, if you put them into the members group and give them edit permission, they can not only view those lists and libraries directly, but they can also change the structure of them. So if you have an app or a flow that is, uses a particular column in a list, and someone in that members group goes in and deletes that column, then you're kind of stuck. You've got to recreate the column, possibly repopulate it. So putting them in any of these is giving them a little more permission than they need. Now within each of these groups, there are basically three types of permissions, or three sets of permissions that are applied. There are list level permissions, site level permissions, and personal permissions. So let's just jump over to a SharePoint site and take a look at that directly. So to get to this from a SharePoint site, I'm going to, this is my human resources site. Now my end goal I'll do in another video is I'll actually walk through the app that I'm building for, basically we have a time clock list here, an asset manager list, which we are going to customize the permissions on to allow users to use these without actually accessing the site. So that's next video, but for this one we're just talking about the permission levels. So to get to that, I'm going to click in the gear icon here and go to Site Permissions, and then I need to click Advanced Site Permissions. Now I will say it is important to note that once you get to this screen, it looks different. It looks less modern. It looks kind of potentially confusing and scary. You can do damage here. So if you were to say come in here and remove or delete the site owners group, that's going to cause problems. So just be careful. Anytime you go into this advanced realm, you really need to kind of watch your step and make sure that you don't delete, especially deleting anything. Creating new things is not often going to cause problems, but deleting things definitely will. So if I go in here and I click on permission levels, we'll see those 5 defaults. Actually, there's another one in there that I forgot, which is review, which is another one of those specialized ones. But if I open up one of these, say full control, we'll see that it will have list permissions, and there are a dozen or so items there, site permissions, and then personal permissions. So basically these allow, or these different permission groups are going to be used to, obviously list permissions defines what this people in with this permission level can do with lists. So can they manage those lists? Can they override list behaviors? Can they add items, edit items, etc.? Going down to site permissions, this is basically where you're saying what level of access, or what can these people in this group or with this level of permission do with the site. So kind of the container itself. Can they do things like view analytics data? Can they create subsites? Can they manage the site, etc.? Again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but just know that these are all in relation to the site itself. And then lastly, we have these personal permissions, which basically allow them to create personal views of lists or libraries, add and remove personal web parts, and update personal web parts. I know very few people who even, end users of SharePoint, who really even know what a web part is, so I don't think you're going to run into many people who really need this access. I generally tend to ignore the personal permissions here, except to say that I don't want these restricted users to have any of those. But you'll see at the bottom here we have this is where we will be able to copy this permission level to create a new one. I'm just going to cancel out. Now if we want to add a new permission level, we can simply click add a new one and give it a name, description, which leads to kind of the caveats here, which are, first off, never ever modify one of those default permission levels. As you saw with the full control, I couldn't actually change any of those. I believe with some of the others you can, but just don't. It will cause problems because in many cases SharePoint and Microsoft 365 expect people who have edit permission to have this level of access to lists or libraries or the site. So don't modify those default permission levels. You either will copy a default permission level and then change it as needed, or start from scratch and just create and add specifically those permissions that you want people to have. When you do that, I tend to prefer creating a new one. It just makes more sense to me. I'd rather just add only those things that I want them to have. But you want to make sure you give that new level a meaningful name and a description so that you'll know later, and other people who might be monitoring or managing the site later will know what those permissions are there for. So I'm going to go back over here and I'm going to create a new entry or new permission level called add data only, and just say this allows users to add data to existing lists but not edit or delete data. So this would be useful in those cases, and I'm not going to go through every possible scenario because you've got what you know in your mind what you need people to do, but you do need to think about it from the standpoint, like what is the minimum level of permission that people, or minimum level of access that people need to this site or to this data. So I want them to be able to add things in. This will be for our time log where I want them to add things, but I don't want them to be able to edit them or delete them. I'm kind of okay with there being an incorrect entry here and there, but I don't want them to be able to delete them just because it will mean deleting data. So in order to do that, all I need to do is go down to our list permission here and select add items. That's it. Now you'll notice that when I click add items, view items automatically gets checked. And that's fine. Basically, these are there's a dependency. In other words, if I'm giving them the permission to add an item, they need permission to view items in the list. Now, they're not actually going to be able to do that through a web browser, as we'll see in the next video, but it is kind of a requirement. If I uncheck that, it will uncheck add item. So there are dependencies. Likewise, as I scroll down a little bit, you'll see that also checked view pages and open to allow users to open the website. Now, kind of the second part of this is we're going to be careful to apply this not to the site. Basically, we're not going to use this to give people permission, this level of access to a site, but just to the list. So in that vein, they're not going to be able to actually access the site itself. But that's all I need to do. So we're going to select add. It'll select the others that are required for that, or the others that are dependent, and I'll click create. Now I might also want to add another permission level, which is edit data. So basically people are I'm going to have data in lists already. They're going to need to look at the data in that list, maybe a list of things that are assigned to them, and edit those items, but not create new items, not delete items. So basically edit only. So allows users to edit list data, but not create new items. So what I need to do is go down and select edit. Now again, you'll see that selects view items and view pages and open. So those are kind of the givens for any of these, but this is going to allow them to not basically simply edit those things and not delete them, not add them, etc. You get the idea. Now I'm not going to go through and create. There's one other that I'll create, which is going to be edit and delete, or might need to create some others. But the point is, you can create the new permission level, add just the level of access that you need. Now we're going to see, as I said in the next video, how to apply this to an actual Power App. But before we do that, I want to talk just some other best practices around permissions. Now, we've been talking SharePoint. So in general, SharePoint permissions are best managed by groups. And in this context, we're talking, you kind of want this to be more global groups. So if we were just talking about controlling people inside the SharePoint site, we could use SharePoint site groups. But in this case, we can't do things like give people access to, we can't share a Power App with a SharePoint site group. So you're better off using Microsoft 365 groups, whether they are groups of teams, or Azure AD security groups. Now, if you're not familiar with Azure AD security groups, I'm going to show you real quick how we can create one of those, which we will later use to permission. Basically, we're going to create a group in Azure AD, add a couple members to it, and then later on, we'll add that group to basically share the lists in our SharePoint site with that Azure AD group, so that we can then share the apps with the same Azure AD group, and we know that we're getting the same population. So the more consistent you can be about this, the more it will save you headaches down the road. So jumping back over here, I'm just going to open a new tab and go to portal.azure.com. Now, you do need to have some level of access to Azure Active Directory to do this. Now, as an end user, you might not have this. Hopefully, if you are an admin of any level in your organization, whether that's SharePoint admin, global admin, etc., you should have access to Azure Active Directory to create these groups. If not, you might need to work with someone in your organization, an admin in your organization, to create these groups for you. But this is probably, and you might also, depending on how your tenant is configured, you might have a local Active Directory that's syncing to Azure. That's going to work as well. However you do it in your organization, that's what you want to do. I'm just going to show Azure because there are a lot of organizations now that I think are strictly going Azure AD and not having that local AD as a starting point. So in my Azure AD here, I'm going to add a new group. Simply click Add Group, and it's going to ask me what type of group. It can either be a security group or Microsoft 365. Microsoft 365 would be basically like an Outlook group or a Microsoft Teams team. I don't want that because I don't want a new SharePoint site. I don't want all that other stuff that comes with it. I just want a group that I can use in various places across the platform. So to permission an app, to permission a SharePoint site, etc. So I'm just going to use security group here. And in my case, I'm going to call this HR app users because it's users of the HR apps. Now, technically, this is probably be everyone in the organization, but I might have some people who don't need to use the HR apps. Maybe there are interns or part-timers or volunteers, whoever that might not need that access. So, but that's what I'm going to call it, and I'll leave the description blank for now. And I do want to make sure that I set an owner for this. I'll make myself the owner, and I will also add Robert Hogan as an owner because he is the head of HR. So we'll select those. So we've got two owners. And then members, for our purposes here, we're going to be adding Andrew Carter and Peter Newkirk. So those will be the members of this group. And that'll make more sense when we demo the other parts of this later. So that's what we have. We'll click Create. And now in our SharePoint site, I can go into, well, again, I'll show this in the next video. We'll go into one of these lists and basically add that user group. Let's just show it now. We have a couple minutes left here. So I'll go to the time clock. So this is the one where I want them to be able to create new entries but not edit or delete. So in here, you need to click the gear icon and go to List Settings and then click on Permissions. Now, generally speaking, I advise people not to edit the permissions of a list or a library in a site, especially team sites. This is that one exception where you do need to give additional permissions to some group or another. So in this case, I'm going to click Stop Inheriting Permissions. That's going to take a snapshot of the current permissions, but allow me to then edit this. So I can now either change any of these permission levels, but again, I don't recommend doing that. But instead what I'm going to do is grant permissions, and I'll look for my HR app users group. I always uncheck this send an email invitation, and then I need to select the permission level. Now for this, I'm going to select the add data only because I want those people simply to be able to log their time entries, but not edit or delete them later. So we'll click share, and I do need to just refresh this to have that show. But now we'll see that the members of that app users group have permission to add data to this list. And if I were to just click check permissions and search for one of them, so I'll search for Newkirk, it'll say that he has permission to add data only given through app users, blah, blah, blah. So that's basically how you're going to set up the permissions of your list. We'll look in the next video about how that actually, kind of how that impacts their experience using the app. Main reason for that is I haven't finished building the app out yet. But I do want to share a couple of my findings just because I know I've already gotten a few questions about this. Like, how well does this actually work? And in my testing, preliminary testing at least, what I found is that this does not allow those users to access that site from the SharePoint start page. So basically, it doesn't appear that they have any permission to the site itself because they don't. They only have access to the list. Next question, well, what about the lists app? Because for a long time, that was kind of the end run that a lot of people could use to get to those lists directly. And it does not allow them to view the lists in the lists app either. Now, what if they have a direct link to the list or an item in the list? It'll also block them from that. So basically, they'll get an access denied because they don't have access to view what they call the application page, which means they can't view that data in a browser. The only way they can access the data is through the app that you're going to build and allow them access to, whatever controls you provide in that app. Now, what about any kind of limitations using this specifically with Power Apps and Power Automate? What I've learned is that if one of those users with that limited permission goes into Power Automate, or I'm sorry, Power Apps, and wants to add a data source, they won't see the site listed. So when you go into Power Apps and add a data source, it'll show you a list of your recent sites or frequent sites. They won't see that site listed. They can paste in the URL of the site. So if they know that all these lists live at, tenant.sharepoint.com/sites/human resources, they could paste that URL in, and then they would see a list of the they would see the list to which they have permission. Now, they still won't be able to do more with that data than what you've given them. So if you don't give them permission to delete the data, they still won't be able to delete the data, but they will be able to connect to it. That might mean that they can see other users' items. So even if you're in your app, you're filtering the data so that they're only seeing their own items, but they can create their own app and point it to that same list. If they technically have permission to view other people's data, then they can see other people's data when they're building their own app. I will say this is probably not a common scenario, but it's certainly something you need to factor in. So if your data is highly secure and confidential, then you want to make sure that you factor this possibility in. And one of the ways around that, well, first off, you want to make sure that you clearly identify what access they need to the data, set up your permission levels appropriately, and then permission your lists appropriately. But you can also leverage something called item level permissions, and this is a built-in setting in SharePoint lists and libraries. So if I go back a step here and we go to our time clock and go to list settings and advanced settings, there is this item level permission section where basically you can specify, in this case it's saying that users can read items that were created by the user, so each person can only see their own. Now I will say people with edit or no, sorry, not edit, with full control access will have their role supersedes this. So full control users can see everything regardless of the item level permission settings. But this will take care of those app end users to be sure that they can only see and access. This is actual security. So this is not just hiding. This is not filtering. This is ensuring that if Peter creates his time log entries, Andrew can't read them, period. So if that's the kind of security you need, then this will help you do that. Now, there's also, that's the read permission. You can also control the create and edit permission. So do you want them to be able to create and edit, basically create and edit all items, which is kind of weird. So if they can only see their own, but you give them access to edit all, it sounds counterintuitive, but it really doesn't, because if they can't see it, they can't edit it or create it. So I generally, if I'm going to select that were created by the user, I pair that with the second choice here, which is create and edit items that were created by the user, which basically means all they can do is they can only work with their own data. They can't modify anybody else's data at all. So you probably want to apply this as well, depending on the security of the data that you are working with in that app, or that the users will be working with in that app. So that's pretty much what I've got so far. So that's how you can, what these custom permission levels are, how you can create one, how you can apply them to, create a Azure AD security group, and then use that security group to give that level of permission to the group of people within a particular list or library in your site. As I said, in another video I will go through kind of the impact this has on that user experience, and then we'll prove to you that, at least unless I disprove it myself, that this will effectively prevent them from taking that end run around your app and accessing that data directly. So there you go. That's all I have for today. So hopefully this is useful, and keep an eye out for the next video in the next few days. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.